the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we are sitting down with the director of the Distance Learning Master's Program in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology, none other than Dr. Nick Campion. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen.
I'm so happy to be speaking with you today, and I remember when we first met, you were in San Diego, and I was a graduate student, and I got in my car and I drove 1,000 miles down the California coast to meet you because you and Bernadette Brady and Darylyn Gunsberg were teaching a weekend-long seminar on medieval astrology, and I just had to be there.
I know. And I'll tell you what, that was a different historical era, because now we would do those enterprises, those events online. Then we used to travel halfway around the world and think nothing of it. And it was fantastic. San Diego, what a wonderful place. We did about 2 of those road shows a year. Amsterdam, I think we went to Seattle, we went to Boston, Cape Town even, and they were fantastic. So, I mean, you're making me nostalgic now, Jen, for a lost era.
I know.
Now it's all Zoom.
And I love that you call it the road show. I mean, that made it exciting. Like, go to the next one.
I know.
Follow their tour around the countries.
You drove 1,000 miles and we'd get there and there'd be new students and new people, and there'd be, and even, I think we sometimes think that some places are exotic and some aren't. For me, everywhere is exotic. So I'd, turn up in San Diego and all those pieces of, Californiana that you don't get elsewhere in the USA, you don't get in Europe, you don't get in England, which are just amazing. I love cultural difference. Anyway, we had a great time, and I'm glad you reminded me of that.
Yeah, it was definitely a life-changing moment for me. Actually, one of my first astrology books was one of yours, but we're not here to talk about me. I would love to know, how did you get into astrology? What was the first astrology book you ever read?
The first astrology book I ever read was a long time in my childhood life after I got into astrology. I'm going to tell you the original story, but we've even heard the word astrology, and this is a true story. There was a Perry Como song called Catch a Falling Star and Put It in Your Pocket. And it was my first earworm. I was about 4 years old. And, I thought stars fell from the sky. So every morning when I went to school, I just started school, I'd think, I'll find a star on the pavement because it would have fallen from the sky. And I thought stars were about, 6 inches from side to side, and made out of gold cardboard, because that's what children do. And I never found one. And so being, a critical thinker, and even at that age, I thought, well, I need to get up earlier, because clearly the fact there aren't any stars on the pavement means the street sweepers have been out and swept them away. So tomorrow I'll get up earlier, but I never managed to get up earlier. I never found the star. But that's the origin of my love of the stars, my fascination for them. So the first astrology book I ever read or ever bought, I was probably about 17. Again, a different era. It was a time when you couldn't just click on Amazon, buy any book you want.
Yeah.
To find books in secondhand bookshops.
It was like a real hunt. Yeah,
so it was Rupert Gleadow's Origins of Astrology, which was published in 1969. And Gleadow was a general, writer who had a big interest in astrology. So he wrote on other topics as well. So I would have bought this probably in 1970 when it was fresh off the printing press. And I bought it in a second-hand shop in Cambridge. That's Cambridge, England. And it was an interesting book because it's partly historical. And so that's the first time I read about the history of astrology, which has become my great passion. But it also included little bits of astrological interpretation. So it wasn't just the history, like this person published this book then and did that next year. It was, this is how they thought of this, the zodiac signs, for example. So I got a little bit of the meaning of astrology there as well. But that was the moment. I remember, I can almost remember the moment. I can remember the smell of the secondhand bookshop. those wonderful, wonderful, musty, dusty old environments.
So history was with you from the beginning.
Well, I got into history, again, a seminal moment, got into history and mythology. So I'll tell you the story. I was 7 years old, sitting in my junior school. So this would have been about 1959 or 60. And into the classroom, they wheeled this big radio, huge thing on wheels. And they played us this program, which was a reading of a chapter from a book on the myths of ancient Greece and Rome. And I can remember the world at that moment became multi-dimensional. And I went off to the library, I found the book, I read it cover to cover in an afternoon, and I never looked back. And that's so, like, astrology, history, and mythology came together. So, and that they've become my big, the things I love. Like, as a historian, I always want to think about, how do we get to where we are now? Where we are now is one thing, but how do we get here? And so that occupies my brain, my entire waking hours.
Well, you were one of the first in a movement of astrologers going back to graduate school to get doctorates and to enter the academy and do a lot of amazing things in changing academia's understanding of astrology.
I actually think the first person in this movement was probably Patrick Curry, who went in the early 80s to study at London University and wrote his PhD on 17th century astrology and for the reasons for its decline in England. And so Patrick was unusual because he also had studied and practiced astrology. And until that point, you'd get historians who would say, well, what is this weird thing? And they'd kind of slightly treat it at arm's length. They were either impartial but thought, look, this is a strange thing, the occult, and it's all now died out. Or they'd say, this is really stupid, but somehow it's part of history, so let's hold our noses while we write about it. And Patrick was the first historian I know of who had studied and practiced astrology and who freed the history of astrology from this need to be judgmental. Then I didn't start my PhD until a good 12 years after he got his. And I wasn't the absolute first to do a PhD on contemporary astrology, but if I wasn't the first, I was about the second. And now there's about a dozen, about half of which I've supervised. So some historians can look at medieval astrology and say, okay, we're used to that. It was okay back then. But how on earth do people still believe this stuff? Which is a daft question because, first of all, people believe all sorts of things, which are weird, if you want to use that word. And secondly, astrology is not just a belief, it's something people do. It's a practice.
Yeah.
So we've sort of broken through that taboo on writing PhDs on contemporary astrology and talking to astrologers and allowing them to speak in their own words, which everybody else is allowed to do. And say, look, what is your interest? What do you do? How do you feel about this? And so on. So, on the master's degree that we teach, all students have a chance to do that, to go out and talk to 4 or 5 astrologers, interview them and say, look, tell me about what you do. How do you feel about astrology? Because as we know, astrology doesn't exist as only one thing. There's major different schools of astrology, some of which are almost like incompatible with each other. And there are some astrologers who regard what other astrologers do as not proper astrology. So we bring all these things together. There's a rich cultural landscape as a result.
Yeah, and your program allows people to get into the non-text, the sort of living text of doing the practice, whereas the transmission of the history of it only can live in texts because those people are not with us anymore.
Texts from the past, and oral transmission now. But the texts, we look at as well, because if you're learning astrology, you look at a text you learn from a book and it says, and if you've got a Mars-Saturn square, you'll be like this, right? So what my interest is and what I try to teach is what's really being said there. That when you were born, Mars in zodiacal longitude was approximately 90 degrees from Saturn. And so you were like this. What on earth are you saying? What are you really saying about the nature of time, the nature of space, the nature of psychic reality, the nature of psychology, the nature of everything, actually? What's being said here? So astrology is often treated this very mundane way. oh, you've got a Venus-Uranus conjunction, so you like unusual relationships. I mean, hang on a minute. Stop. Let's unpack this for a minute.
Well, and the other thing that's inimical to a lot of the modern texts produced about astrology is that they assume they're the first person to ever think of a thing, and so there's no cross-citation of ancestors and others who've written before them just saying, this is what this means. And it's like,
exactly.
You're not the first person to think that. Let's talk about the others,
There are lineages. That's right.
Yeah.
So, you do get people who write books saying, this is what I'm saying. It's all new. But hang on. First of all, you read it somewhere to start off with, or somebody taught it to you. They got it from somebody else. So I do love going back to the old texts.
So you can choose. I'm going to give you two choices. You can be sealed up in a temple on Malta, or you can go to the dark sky park of Sark.
Yeah, and I know you're talking here, aren't you, Jen, about two of our Sophia Centre press books?
Yes, Sark in the Dark, about the dark sky park in Sark.
Yeah, and Tore Lomsdalen's book on the Maltese temples, both of which, in my view, are classics. Anyway, I would go to Sark because I just love that idea of dark skies, a direct exposure to the sky.
So you can read by day and stargaze by night.
Yeah, and if the full moon is bright enough, you can also just about read if you're reading from like a children's book with big print.
Okay, so you get to take 3 books with you. Which books do you choose?
Okay, my first book will be William Lilly's Christian Astrology, which I've been consulting quite a bit recently because I've written a couple of book chapters about 17th century astrology and following through on how would William Lilly consult and read a horoscope. And so there are foundational points there for modern astrology, but also my Latin is not up to much. And so his is the first book that we can read in the original English. It's not translated, it's his words. My only question about it, he's got all these chart examples, and they're all retrospective. So this person came to see me and asked if they were going to get well again, or, whatever they asked. There's a great variety of horary questions, and they're all retrospective.
Every single one of them is retrospective?
Yeah, of course they are, because they're published after the event.
He wasn't taking notes saying, someone came today and I'm predicting this, and then they came back 2 weeks later and that's what happened.
Yeah, that's what he says, but it's all retrospective. He's written that up later.
So he could have theoretically not included the examples that didn't work.
Yeah, but they all work.
But we don't have the examples that didn't because he might not have put them in.
Yeah, exactly. But that's like all astrological publishing, isn't it? 99.9% of chart examples given in astrology books are about the chart working. One of the points about astrology, which you just have to accept, is that it always works. And I'm not saying that. That is not me, Nick Campion, saying astrology always works. But if I observe the way it is practiced as a way of thinking, being, whatever, I observe that in that culture, in that milieu, it always works. My fascination for astrology is deeply connected to a fascination for other big theories, grand theories of history and humanity and mythology and so on. So, yeah, I've got this big picture. How does the world work? And my particular study often turns out to be, how does astrology say the world works?
Right. And Lilly, to get back to Lilly specifically, has such an intense collection of questions that you could really go into so many areas of human life.
Yeah. And also, I'm fascinated by what he implies about time and space and freedom, because astrology always has difficulty navigating issues of personal responsibility. And the extent to which that framework, that astrological framework, which says things are broadly like the way they are because Mars is squared Saturn or Venus is conjunct Uranus, how do you navigate that framework? And there's different ways of navigating that. For example, you could say that the soul exists outside the astrological framework and incarnates in the body separately and always remains autonomous. But every school of astrology has to somehow navigate this. So I'm fascinated when I read William Lilly's sample horary readings I love to look at how is he saying that the individual has choice, because in some of his readings, he'll say something like, the matter eventuated according to the positions of the planets. And the person has to act, but also act in accord with the way in which things eventuate. And this is the paradox which I think astrology has been negotiating ever since it left Babylon and moved to Greece and India. It's very easy to think about astrology hierarchically. It's often portrayed hierarchically. You've got this big cosmic level, which might be God if you think that way, or if it's Plato, it's the great consciousness. And then influences or signification can be seen as cascading downwards hierarchically until they get to people. But if you think about as below, so above, then the whole situation stops being hierarchical. And we've moved much closer to modern ideas of entanglement, interconnectivity. There's two French philosophers, Félix Deleuze and Guattari, who talk about assemblages. So everything is an assemblage, and everything is, completely non-hierarchical, and anything can be the center of the assemblage. And assemblages don't have any boundaries. So you can apply that model. I've just written a book chapter on 17th century astrological medicine, applying that model and saying what we've got is an assemblage of everything. So in the case of William Lilly diagnosing a medical condition of somebody's come to ask him a question, you've got the astrologer and the patient, you've got all their total circumstances and backgrounds. You might want to go to their parents, their grandparents, their so on. You've got the herbs which Lilly might be recommending, or treatments, and their origins and development and evolution. You've got the weather, you just go on and on and on and on. So you can't find any center of the system. You've just got a total picture, because, if you're treating somebody's 17th century medicine, you're looking at their humours, and the humours are responding to the weather. Is it raining? Is it dry? If you cast a horoscope for night or day, you might get a different reading.
Well, one thing he's not doing is looking at a natal chart. I mean, sometimes yes, but sometimes people didn't have charts.
Yes.
And that, to me, is an ontologically interesting question.
Ontology, yeah, to do with the nature of being. And it's epistemological as well. It's to do with the nature of knowledge.
Like, where's your soul in the horary? But it's there. It's just not necessarily, there in the way that we think of natal astrology. It's a different showing up.
I mean, it's everywhere, isn't it? It's in the time, or the time and the place, because, a horoscope is cast for a time and a place. And there's not quite Einsteinian relativity, because it's moving in that direction, so that if you move to a different place, but you're at the same time, then the reading is different and your humours might be different. So, somebody in William Lilly's consulting in London will have one reading, and somebody who is consulting an astrologer in Delhi at the same time will have exactly the same planetary aspects and planets in signs, but all the planets will be in different houses, and the weather will be different.
Yeah.
So there's time and space relativity there of a kind.
Mm-hmm. Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support Kaylee before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the Kaylee Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.kaylee.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support Kaylee into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So back to Sark. That was book 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have 2 more to pick.
Okay. I will go for Margaret Hone's Modern Text-Book of Astrology.
Why did that one make the list?
Okay. Now, this was one of the main teaching books in the English-speaking world from about 1951 to when it was published into the early 70s. It was a textbook for the Faculty of Astrological Studies based in London. And during that time, the faculty became, after very uncertain beginnings, It became the most structured teaching of astrology course in the English-speaking world. Even in the USA, there were many students. So it's an influential book for that reason. And Margaret Hone was principal of the faculty. Now, of course, there's a proliferation of astrology schools. And it's an interesting book because it is psychological, okay? It's part of a process in 20th century astrology to look at psychic or psychological, so spiritual or psychological astrology. Natal astrology is primary rather than looking at events. And Margaret Hone is preceded by Anne and Leo very significantly, but for whom astrology was a matter of understanding the soul. Margaret Hone leaves the soul out of things. There's no reincarnation. It's just about your personality in the here and now. So it really establishes a psychological astrology of character description or personality description as primary, and therefore an astrology of self-knowledge as primary. I mean, again, we've talked about nothing being new. Well, Margaret Hone was very influenced by Dane Rudyard, and in fact, she credits Dane Rudyard in the book. So Dane Rudyard's been there already, but with Dane Rudyard's work, it's very difficult to use his work to read a horoscope if you're a student. You read 10 of Dane Rudyard's books and say, well, what do I do now somebody's come to me for a reading? Well, you're kind of stumped, really. Whereas Margaret Hone has got everything set out very clearly, this planet in that house, in that sign, and in that aspect, 3 kinds of aspects: disharmonious, harmonious, and conjunction. And so you've always got your box ticking exercise for learning astrology. So very, very effective. It's significant for those 2 reasons, like establishing the astrology of personality description and being a very, very clear textbook. Totally natal astrology. No horror astrology, no mundane astrology, no electional astrology. So it's making the point that any other kind of astrology is fundamentally dependent on who you are. So not that much point in asking a horary chart, because the important thing is who you are. And even with mundane astrology, which I just don't think she was that interested in, a starting point can be who you are, because Hone also, I think she was aware of Jung. Jung's work took decades to reach through to being familiar to astrologers. But, Jung is very keen on the point, as is Freud, that self-understanding is the basis of any developments in society or history initially. So, Marxism goes the other way. There's big forces of history have to fit in with them. That whole psychological revolution with Freud, Jung, Carl Rogers, and so on takes it back to the individual and says understanding yourself is the first point of all political and social change. So I'm guessing that Margaret Hone would have held that philosophy. So it's an important book. It also happens to be the book that I learnt astrology from when I signed up to study astrology in about 1973. There's another book I've got to mention, which was Teach Yourself Astrology by Jeff Mayo, which is like a shorter but very similar, slightly later version. And recently, I've been talking about going back to texts and thinking what they're really saying. I've been going back to Margaret Hone. What's she really saying about time and space and the human personality? And one thing she does say explicitly is that everything is interconnected. Nothing is outside the system. So again, it's this non-hierarchical view of absolutely everything being connected. And so in that sense, astrology then becomes a convenient guide or map, but it's not a causal feature. A lot of critics of astrology completely misunderstand this point.
Yeah, but there is a causality here in that it sounds like Margaret Hone has had a massive impact on how astrology was taught in a generation prior to this current generation. So
yes,
in a way, her method of organizing the information has proliferated almost as this new unconscious peat moss that we're all sprouting from.
Yeah. She's not a well-known figure because she really only wrote 2 books. I don't know these days if you ask 20-year-old students of astrology, have you heard of her? Probably not. But then that's an example of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
the ancestors in the lineage can very quickly fade. And I think that it's important to go back and look at the earlier texts because you find out more about where you're coming from. I think it should be always a part of astrological training.
Yeah. Well, that's partly the reason for this podcast, is to remind people of all the various books.
Absolutely. And it's the reason why I set up my program.
Which is an amazing program. So, yes.
So my third book will be Liz Green's Saturn. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, it's the partner of her other book. Came out around the same time, Relating. They came out in 1976 and 77. And every book I think that she's written since then has been an elaboration of what she published back then, which I think was a breakthrough. And the reason I think it was a breakthrough was because she developed the ideas of planets and zodiac signs as processes. Of course, Rudyard'd been there already. I think it's incredibly important to read Dade Rudyard if you want to understand modern astrology, but difficult if you're a student. So Liz Green organised her work differently to Margaret Hone. So she wasn't saying, right, Saturn in the first house, little paragraph here. But she did actually give in Saturn sample readings for major Saturn configurations, and they're all in terms of process. So the planetary symbol has a whole spectrum of meanings. So from, Saturn, inhibition and failure, to discipline and success, for example. And those are not different options. Like if you've got Saturn here, it's inhibition and failure, or Saturn there, it's discipline and success. They're part of a possible process through which the individual can move. She still, I think, Liz still is in the same position, I think, as the whole of astrology in having to navigate this difficult relationship with understanding fate. And sometimes she gets around that by saying that there's a part of the person which is not in the horoscope, and sometimes saying actually the whole person is in the horoscope. And I think that is difficult for all astrologers to work out. It's a universal problem. But that aside, what she always does is allow some personal autonomy in order for people to navigate through an understanding of the symbol. And so ultimately, through self-awareness, to change their lives around. That's the purpose of it. So the purpose is personal change. And I think, again, it's a seminal work. And Liz is massively influential on the whole of modern astrology through her extensive publishing. She published a collection of seminar transcripts just now, last month or so ago, through the Centre for Psychological Astrology, which had a teaching program which was very fluid and flexible. Like, she would ask any person she liked who thought they was doing interesting work to come along and give a seminar. And so very influential through the number of astrology students who attended those seminars. So for me, in the books I've picked, it's, I think, three seminal works. The first work, the first detailed astrology book to be published in English, the first book to clearly set out a personality description-oriented astrology for modern students, and the first book to set out a really dynamic process-oriented view of astrology for modern students.
Speaking of modern students, if you were talking to someone who is just beginning to get interested in astrology and isn't necessarily at the graduate level, what text would you point them to?
I think there's nothing completely that covers all the territory, but I would recommend The Complete Astrologer by Julia and Derek Parker. It's a book which is heavily influenced by Margaret Hone. So it provides, sample readings, heavily based on natal astrology and a personality approach to natal astrology to do with understanding your personality, therefore being able to manage your life better. But it's much lighter than Margaret Hone. Honestly, although Margaret Hone, I think, is very influential, it's a bit dry. And now I go back and read it, I think, this is amazing. What's she being said? This is, what's really being said, that idea. So the Parker's is much lighter, and it's a big format illustrated book. I think that it was republished as The New Complete Astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
It's well written. Both Derek and Julia Parker were journalists. I think Derek Parker had a great career on radio, I believe. So good writers and good teachers. And so it's a clear book. If you want to study horary astrology, if you want to know about a soul-based astrology or something else, soul-based natal astrology, then you've got to go on from there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great beginner's book.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Jen, it's been an absolute delight.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at caeli.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.